Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Ryanair is set to announce a new UK flight schedule for 2018 later this morning. That's coming out at about 10 o'clock, and it comes as the low-cost airline eyes up the possibility of buying new European routes from the German carrier Air Berlin, which has gone into administration. However, with Brexit looming, Ryanair has warned it may have to temporarily stop UK flights in the event of a no deal with Europe. Well, that is worst case scenario. We can talk to Michael O'Leary, the boss of Ryanair. He joins me now from central London. Good morning to you, Mr. O'Leary.
Morning, Sarah Jane. I'm very impressed with the toilet facilities there.
Yes, I must point out they are not sky-wide. That's just very much a one-off, that golden toilet.
Superstars, gold toilets.
Well, you keep costs low at Ryanair. You don't get those on your aircraft. But in order to keep costs low, I want to talk to you about plans for 2019. Now, I remember speaking to you back in March when Article 50 was triggered, and you talked about a worst-case scenario, that if the government didn't get its house in order with the EU, come March 2019, a hard Brexit could stop all flights between the UK and the EU. Are you planning for that worst-case scenario still?
We are, and I think the worst-case scenario is becoming more and more likely at the moment. As you saw in the earlier report this morning, the negotiations are not going well. The Europeans are not moving. What did the British expect? The Europeans will not move. And the problem is the onus is on the British government to deliver a deal. If there's no deal by March 19, Britain gets thrown out of the European Union, you're out of open skies and there will be no flights. And we've been asking Mrs May's government, what's the plan? What's plan B? And we haven't got any plan B. We haven't even got plan A and a half yet.
Are you involved in the conversation? Because as I said, you have been arguing from the start that this is an issue that needs to be addressed with urgency. You're already planning for next year. In the next couple of months, you'll be planning for 2019. And you don't know if you're going to be able to operate. With topics like the Irish border, immigration, the huge divorce bill settlement and trade, is the airline industry getting a look in at the moment?
We're not, and no industry is getting a look in. I mean, most of the sectors, the German car manufacturers, the airlines, the airports, the Spanish hoteliers, the sectors are not being consulted with yet because the negotiations are going nowhere until they solve the first three issues, which, as you rightly say, is the Irish question, EU citizens' rights here in the UK, and the divorce bill. There will be no trade talks. And the problem for the aviation industry is we need to know 6 months before March 19. So about this time next year, September, October 2018, if there isn't the likelihood or the outcome of an agreement, there will be skin and hair flying. People trying to book their holidays for summer 19 here in the UK, this time next year, will be faced with the options will be drive to Scotland or get a ferry to Ireland.
Well, that is going to throw people's holiday plans into chaos. That puts a slightly different slant on your summer holiday, doesn't it? Taking a ferry or driving rather than getting a quick flight. But you are planning for the future. I mentioned there before Air Berlin has gone into administration. You're thinking about buying up some of the routes. So you're still planning ahead. After Brexit, how do you see your company looking?
Well, see, the advantage for us, Sarah Jane, is we're Irish registered, so we will still be within the EU. We're still free to fly within the EU. The big question is whether we'll be able to fly to and from the UK or not. But we're growing strongly. This morning in London, we're announcing a big increase in the schedule for summer 18 here in the UK. We'll have new routes, many new destinations, and much more importantly, even lower fares. So we're planning on the basis that somebody in the British government will sort out the Brexit. I don't have great faith in them at the moment, given the way they're going, but we have to plan on the basis that it will continue, and we're going to continue to invest in the UK and grow jobs here.
It's quite interesting you say that you hope somebody will be able to sort this out when it comes to Brexit. That somebody should be the Prime Minister Theresa May or the Brexit Secretary David Davis. Have you got full confidence in them?
No. I mean, I fail to see what she's doing in Japan for 3 days at the moment, why she's not in Brussels or in Frankfurt or in Paris, which is where these negotiations need to take place. I mean, she's just come back from 3 weeks' holidays in the Swiss Alps. Now, everybody's entitled to their holidays, but there is a crisis coming down the road here at the UK economy in the next 12 months. The Brexit is going to be a disaster for the UK economy, and she needs to be over there negotiating or at least removing these roadblocks, not swanning around Japan drinking tea and sake.
Well, she said she's no quitter. She's going to be with us until 2022 at least.
Oh, she says lots of things. Look at the way she handled the last general election. I'm not sure she'll be allowed into the next election. But, I don't really care about the politics, or Mrs. May's future is irrelevant. What's really relevant to the British people and is the state of the economy here. And yet the Brexit talks are going nowhere. They are a bit of a shambles, and they need a bit of leadership. They're clearly, David Davis is not delivering it. You need the Prime Minister not swanning around Japan for 3 days, but in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in Paris, doing the deal instead of just, parroting out cliches about doing a great deal for Britain. Do it. Get on with it. And from an aviation perspective, the real challenge for us is, because there's no fallback in aviation, we're not covered by WTO rules, there is going to be a cessation of flights from March 2019 if she doesn't get her finger out and get a deal done in the next 12 months.
OK, you're giving the Prime Minister a bit of a tough time there. I do have to give you a bit of a tough time, though, Michael O'Leary, because you'll have opened up your newspaper this week to the story of a mother and daughter who tried to board a Ryanair flight in Alicante. They were refused to be able to get onto that flight because their hand luggage was too big, and the mother said she couldn't pay the fee because her wages didn't go into her bank account until the next day. And her and her daughter couldn't get on that flight because they couldn't pay the money and had to sleep on the floor at Alicante Airport. Obviously, everybody does fall foul of the hand luggage laws, but what people are struggling with is the fact that when you talk to Ryanair, there's no wiggle room. I mean, could these mother and daughter not have got on the flight and paid the bill later? Why should they have to sleep on an airport floor?
Well, I mean, they don't, and, while I regret the case in question, there is routine flouting of the carry-on baggage rules by passengers all over Europe at the moment. We allow people to bring 2 carry-on bags, 1 large, 1 small. This lady was travelling with 2 large carry-on bags. And if you break the rules are very simple. But if you break the rules...
extenuating circumstances. This woman was saying, I don't actually get paid until tomorrow. I can't afford £100 right now.
That's actually not true. The lady in question paid for her tickets by credit card. She has her credit card. She can pay the additional fee. It's nothing to do with having money in your bank account. You don't pay your credit card bill for another month anyway. This is a case where the lady in question decided she didn't want to pay the fee. The fee was validly charged, and if she doesn't want to pay, then I'm sorry, she can't fly. Those are the rules. 99.9% of our 130 million customers obey the rules, but we have 1 or 2 who won't, and if you don't, I'm sorry, you either pay the fee for the outsized baggage or you can't fly.
OK, we all try to obey the rules on hand luggage, but one quick question before we go. When are we going to see a uniform rule across all airline carriers on hand luggage? Because what catches people out is if they're catching connecting flights, there'll be 1 rule for one airline in terms of size and weight, and then 1 rule for another.
The rules are pretty standardised at the moment, Sarah Jane. Look, most people know there's the size of the wheelie bag that you can bring on board an aircraft. If your luggage is a wheelie bag, it'll get on board the aircraft. But the amount of passengers who simply disregard that and bring much larger cases down to they can't get on. And so it's reasonably simple. We have very few cases such as this. We carry about 2.5 million passengers every single day. And cases like this, which are regrettable, but happen very rarely, 99.9% of customers know the rules, obey the rules, and don't have any difficulty.
OK, Michael O'Leary from Ryanair. Really good to speak to you this morning here on Sunrise. Thank you very much. Ryan announcing their new flight schedule for next year at 10 o'clock this morning. Thank you.
Let's turn to our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone, who joins us now from Brussels, where we're expecting another press conference to begin about half an hour from now. This one will be keenly listened to as well, won't it, Mark? Michel Barnier, David Davis, news of progress or not?
Yes, and I think this news conference that we're awaiting has been carefully timed to happen after that which Theresa May just gave with Shinzo Abe, because clearly David Davis was wanting to hear any update that end. And clearly, as we heard from Shinzo Abe and from Theresa May, the issues of Brexit are global. Shinzo Abe was asked directly whether he had had any reassurance from Theresa May that he could pass on to Japanese companies, some 1,000 of them in the UK, as to whether or not they ought to remain there, because we know that some Japanese companies are already upping sticks and moving. And what about the other 1,000? Should they stay? Should they remove? What reassurances did Theresa May give to Japan on that? And he said simply that the Japanese companies are there because Britain is, at the moment, moment the gateway to Europe. It links to what Michael Heseltine was just saying. They moved there because it was the gateway to Europe. What they need to have now, as many other companies need to have, global companies which aren't part of the EU, is reassurance that that global gateway to Europe will continue, which means continued access of some kind to the single market. And that goes to the heart of those negotiations which are drawing to a close now in their third week in as many months, and which have gone very, very difficult. I was struck that Theresa May made quite clear in her statement there that she believes that at the beginning of the transition period, which everyone accepts will now happen, that is March 2019 onwards, Britain will have the ability immediately to do trade deals, and Japan is one of the countries at the front of the queue, so she says. Well, that suggests that Britain believes that it will have some sort of separate arrangement with the EU by March 2019. That is looking increasingly unlikely because they are still arguing over the separation issues, and it looks at the moment as though they won't have come to any agreement on the separation issues by October. And what that does is it narrows the period of time in which Britain and the EU can discuss that future relationship. There is a growing school of thought now that what may end up happening is that the status quo will remain in the transition period. So for all intents and purposes, Britain will remain in the European Union in exactly the same position as it is now for a number of years after so-called Brexit date. And that will mean that what Theresa May just said in Tokyo is wrong. They will not be able to carry out trade deals post-March 2019 because they'll still effectively be a member of the EU.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Straight to Brussels. Michel Barnier, David Davis, Brexit.
David Davis et moi-même et nos équipes, nous venons de terminer ce troisième round de négociations. Des équipes d'ailleurs que je veux personnellement remercier pour leur engagement et pour leurs compétences. Lundi, en accueillant David, j'ai dit I am concerned. J'ai dit ma préoccupation. Le temps passe vite. C'est un temps court.
And it was short to start with every passing day, we move closer to the date for departure of the UK from the EU. Just to remind you, the 29th of March 2019, upon the stroke of midnight. The fundamental question to which we must find an answer is this. Upon that day, the 29th of March 2019, midnight, upon that day, will we have organised a proper orderly withdrawal for the UK? Or will the UK be exiting the EU without agreement? Without agreement with the EU, with all the consequences that we have already explained. For our part, in the common interest, beyond even just the EU and the UK's interest, in the interest of the European continent, we believe that the best way is with agreement. Over the course of this week, ladies and gentlemen, we have made a number of clarifications, useful clarifications, on a number of points, many points. For instance, there's the status of border workers, the aggregation or totalization of social security rights, dealing with pending cases and procedures in the Court of Justice, just to cite a few amongst many. However, we did not get any decisive progress on any of the principal subjects, even though, I want to say, even though on the discussion we've had about Ireland, that discussion was fruitful. This is a topic which I personally follow very closely. I follow all of them. But I would like to say that on that subject we have made genuine progress. On the question of the common travel area, on the basis of guarantees from the United Kingdom. And we've also been able to clarify, Sabine and Ollie, We have clarified work that still needs to be done in a constructive spirit, in particular on North-South cooperation in the framework of the Good Friday Agreement. So that's been something. However, as I've said before, time is pressing if we want to get what we want, which is a global agreement. At the current state of progress, we're quite far from being able to say that sufficient progress has taken place. Sufficient for me to be able to recommend to the European Council that it engage in discussions on the future relationship between the UK and the EU at the same time as we would during the course of 2018 go on working on finalising the exit and withdrawal agreement. So that's what I'm taking on our side from this third round. Now, since I'm here before you today, I'd also like to take this opportunity to underscore 3 points that are part of the general backdrop to this negotiation. These 3 points need to be well understood, perhaps better understood in some cases than they currently seem to be. First of all, this negotiation is an unusual one, to say the least. It is unprecedented. It's particularly true for us in the European Commission. We're working with all the expertise of our people and services, and I thank them for that expertise, under the full authority of President Juncker, and we're working on the basis of a mandate. This mandate was fixed to us from the outset, from day one, by the 27 heads of state and government, meeting as they were in European Council under the presidency of Donald Tusk. Naturally, we also work very closely with the European Parliament under the aegis of President Antonio Tajani. The European Parliament very early took a very strong stand with a very large majority in its resolution. Please don't underestimate the role of European Parliament. That's one point I want to make. Now, this mandate, which was unanimously approved by the 27 heads of state and government, this mandate is what I am scrupulously taking forward. It is very clear and precise. It sets out a sequencing. It asks us to do things in the correct order to succeed. It clearly mentions conditions for a transition period if the UK should so request. It asks us to organise the orderly withdrawal in a way which takes into account a future relation, or what I called a new partnership. Those who seek to find the least difference between what this European negotiation team is doing and that which was tasked by the member states, those people are wasting their time if they seek one iota of difference.
Stipulated precisely in the guidelines of the European Council, protecting the EU legal order and protecting the integrity of the single market are core principles. Decided to leave the European Union. The UK government decided to leave the single market and the customs union. We respect this sovereign decision. One thing is clear. The single market, the EU capacity to regulate, to supervise, to enforce our laws must not and will not be undermined by Brexit. The UK strongly contributed to the development of our single market, which is the foundation of the EU. It understands well, very well, how it works. The European Council guidelines state that the Union will preserve its autonomy of decision-making. The UK wants to take back control, wants to adopt its own standards and regulations, well, but it also wants to have these standards recognised automatically in the EU. That is what UK papers ask for. This is simply impossible. You cannot be outside the single market and shape its legal order. Thirdly, the first phase of this negotiation is about creating trust. Let me take two examples where we still need to build trust. On citizens' rights, we have clarified a few points this week, usually, but we need to go further to reassure citizens. Over the summer, around 100 EU and EEA citizens living lawfully in the UK received deportation letters. The UK government quickly recognised that it was a mistake. But this is not the first time that something like this has happened. It reinforces the need to ensure that citizens' rights are directly enforceable in front of national jurisdictions under the control of the European Court of Justice, a point on which we disagree today. On the financial settlement, EU taxpayers should not pay at 27 for the obligations undertaken at 28. It would not be fair. In July, the UK recognised that it has obligations beyond the Brexit date. But this week, the UK explained that these obligations will be limited to their last payment to the EU budget before departure. Yet we have joint obligations towards third countries. For example, we have guaranteed long-term loans to Ukraine together. We jointly support development in Africa, Caribbean and Pacific countries through the European Development Fund. After this week, it is clear that the UK does not feel legally obliged to honour these obligations after departure. We have also jointly committed to support innovative enterprises and green infrastructure in European regions until 2020. These are not recognised by the UK as legal obligations. Which shuts uncertainty, how can we build trust and start discussing a future relationship? We need to address together these issues seriously and rigorously. Mesdames et Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, I never thought that this negotiation would be easy. I always knew, I've always said, including before you, even from day one, last November, I've always said that this would be complex and that Brexit will have many consequences. Social consequences, human consequences, technical ones, financial ones, economic, legal. Now, over the last 3 days I've seen, again, that there is a lot of commitment on both sides in both our delegations, and I want to stress that. And that really strengthens our determination and our spirit on behalf of the 27 to go forward with the hope of getting an agreement. That's the spirit. Time is flying. It's passing very quickly. If we need to, we on our side, on behalf of the 27, are prepared, on behalf of the EU institutions, to step up and intensify the rhythm of those negotiations. That's all I have to say. Thank you. I'll give the floor to David now.
Thank you, Michel. And can I start by adding my compliments to both teams to yours. They've worked incredibly hard this week. It's been as ever with an important negotiation, quite a high-stress week in terms of their work. So they deserve our compliments and our thanks. Now, this week we've had long and detailed discussions across multiple areas, and I think it's fair to say we've seen some concrete progress. I mean, Michel referred to one, but there's more than that. However, as I said at the start of the week, it's only through flexibility and imagination that we'll achieve a deal that works truly for both sides. In some areas, we have found this from the Commission side, which I welcome, but there remains some way to go. Talks this week have once again focused on citizens' rights, on financial matters, on Northern Ireland and Ireland, and on issues relating to our separation. And I'm pleased to say we've engaged in detail on all of those areas. Now, when I met Michel here on Monday to open this third round of negotiations, I set out the need for us to drive forward the technical discussions. I want us to establish the areas where we agree and work through the areas where we disagree to ensure that we make further progress on a whole range of issues, and I think we've delivered that. The UK's approach has been informed by a series of detailed papers on customs, on Northern Ireland, on goods, on civil judicial cooperation, on data, on enforcement and dispute resolution, and on technical matters regarding our separation, such as ongoing confidentiality obligations. These papers represent hard work and detailed thinking that has been going on behind the scenes across Whitehall over the past 12 months. They offer pragmatic and innovative solutions to issues related to our withdrawal and the future deep and special partnership that we want with the European Union. They do not aim to dictate a single approach, but rather considered options for us to work on. As I've said all along, issues around our withdrawal and our future relationship are inextricably linked. Our approach of setting out positions on them both is designed to progress the current negotiations as swiftly as possible. And I note what Michel has just said on that. I'll come back to that in a moment. And that approach is already bearing fruit. But beyond the debates around process and technicalities, at the heart of this process must be a desire to deliver the best outcome for the people and the businesses of the European Union and the United Kingdom. And the most obvious area for that is on citizens' rights, which remain a top priority. This week we've discussed a wide range of issues which will have a significant impact on people's lives. In particular, both sides have agreed to protect the rights of frontier workers, to cover future social security contributions, so those covered by the withdrawal agreement, that we should at least protect existing healthcare rights in arrangements with the EU 27 citizens of the UK and UK nationals in the EU, the EHIC arrangements. That's good news, for example, for British pensioners in the EU. It means they'll continue to have their healthcare arrangements protected, both where they live and when they travel to another member state, to be able to use an EHIC card. On economic rights, we've secured the right of British citizens to, in the EU 27 to set up and manage a business within their member state of residence, and of course vice versa. On mutual recognition of qualifications, we've made progress on protecting the recognition of qualifications for British citizens resident in the EU27 and EU27 citizens in the UK. For every one of these, of course, in fact every single thing I've said, all of these are reciprocal. They work for Brits in the UK and in the EU and EU27 in the UK. To that end, we will shortly be publishing a comparison of the UK-EU positions. And we've had further discussions on the governance of citizens' rights agreements and the wider withdrawal agreement. We've shown a willingness to discuss creative solutions in this area, and now is the time for the Commission to match that. On the financial settlement, the central point, I think, of Michel's comments, the Commission has set out its position, and we have a duty to our taxpayers to interrogate it rigorously. At this round, we presented our legal analysis on on-budget issues, on off-budget issues, and on the EIB, the European Investment Bank. It's fair to say across the piece we have a very different legal stance. But as we said in the Article 50 letter, the settlement should be in accordance with law and in the spirit of the UK's continuing partnership with the EU. And I'll repeat that phrase, in accordance with law and in the spirit of the UK's continuing partnership with the EU. Now, Michel and I agreed in the last round, it's clear we won't be making incremental progress on a final shape of deal on this in every round, and I think this round demonstrates that. I think we've succeeded in building mutual understanding, but it's also clear that there are still significant differences to be bridged. On Ireland and Northern Ireland, Michel gave credit to this. Our coordinators have met again to build on discussions in July. We've had a good discussion on maintaining the common travel area and on safeguarding the Good Friday Agreement on the basis of the UK paper. We think there's a high degree of convergence on these key issues, and we agreed to work up shared principles in the common travel area. We also agreed to carry out further joint technical work on cross-border cooperation under the Good Friday Agreement. On separation issues, we've had good discussions on the detail of papers the UK published ahead of the round. We've reached almost complete agreement on our approach to post-exit privileges and immunities, which benefits both the UK and the EU to maintain after we leave, and on our mutual approach to confidentiality requirements on shared information post-exit. On Euratom and other institutional issues, we've built upon discussions in July and are well placed to make even more progress in the next round. We remain committed to making as much progress as possible on these issues that are solely related to our withdrawal, but our discussions this week have exposed yet again that the UK's approach is substantially more flexible and pragmatic than that of the EU, as it avoids unnecessary disruption for businesses and consumers. We propose pragmatic solutions to prevent this disruption, and we urge the EU to be more imaginative and flexible in their approach to withdrawal on this point. However, I remain of the view that on this, as in many areas, there's an unavoidable overlap between withdrawal and the future, and they cannot be neatly compartmentalised. To conclude, the third round of talks have been productive and are an important stepping stone and key building block for discussions to come. We're peeling away the layers one by one, working through many issues at speed and moving towards the core of these important matters. We've locked in points of agreement, unpicked areas of divergence. Being dynamic is integral to driving forward these talks at pace and providing the best outcomes for people and businesses, not just in the UK but in the EU as well. And Michel referred to the issue of time, the 29th of March 2019, midnight. I've said from the beginning of this process, some parts of this will be turbulent, hard, difficult, and of course we will see that because there are differences of view which have to be resolved. But both sides, and this was very apparent this week, both teams aim to be constructive, aim to get an outcome which is in the benefit of both the European Union and the United Kingdom. That's the aim of both teams. So my message to Michel in response to his comments and his team as we turn our heads to the next round of talks is let's continue to work together constructively to put people above process. As discussions in June, July and again this week have shown, our separation from the European Union and our future relationship is inextricably linked. We can only resolve some of these issues with an eye on how the new partnership between us will work in the future. This is not about skipping ahead or trying to reopen previous discussions. It's about pragmatically driving the process we all want to see. To that end, my team will publish further papers in the coming weeks, continue to set out our ambition for these negotiations and the new deep and special partnership the UK wants to build with the EU. I look forward to the next round of talks. Thank you.
Thank you. We can now switch to your questions. Let's start here from the right.
Thank you, James Mains from ITV News. Mr Davis, it's clear that the EU side is demanding more clarity. The Prime Minister says the British are providing that clarity. You say your stance is one of constructive ambiguity. Which is it? And Mr Barnier, if I may ask you, you seem frustrated, almost angry at the way these talks have gone this week. Do you think there is any chance of sufficient progress having been made by October?
Welcome again. Like father, like son. The constructive ambiguity actually is not a phrase of mine. I think it comes from Kissinger, actually, but there we are. Look, we have been very clear in all of this from the beginning. The Prime Minister made the Lancaster House speech, the most thorough speech on this subject ever made, I suspect. There was the two white papers. There's the Article 50 letter, an extensive and detailed letter about where we're going. And I think almost a dozen, I think it's 11 papers to date on what we are seeking to do, our perspective of this. And as I said, the papers don't always say this is one route to go. Sometimes there's 1, 2, 3 options that have been used in the past. Indeed, that sometimes gets us into trouble when we're as open as that. So the aim, the Prime Minister's right. Our aims and our intentions are crystal clear. Our ask is crystal clear. How we get there isn't always certain, but that's what the point of this negotiation is, to deliver a good outcome for both Britain and Europe.
While David was answering his question, I was wondering how you saw that I was angry and frustrated. I think I have shown a typical calm of a mountaineer, a calm I try to maintain. And I haven't been or wanted to show that I'm frustrated. I have shown perhaps that I'm impatient. I've never shown any anger. I have tried to show determination. And if I do get angry someday, it will be very obvious, I assure you. But it's not the case. Now, I am both impatient and determined. And that is why what I would recommend, if we want to succeed, is to be as constructive as possible and as unambiguous as possible.
David there at the center. Can you wave so that... Yeah.
David Hudson with Politico. Thank you. For Mr. Barnier, you've often talked over these months about the benefits of membership in the EU. And I wonder if you can point to anything you've seen in the paperwork, the discussions that you've had with the UK that shows the British side acknowledging and conceding that it is giving up those benefits rather than trying to keep all those benefits going forward into a new partnership. And for Mr. Davis, you've now talked to us twice this week about the need for flexibility. Are you seeing, after 3 rounds of talks, sufficient flexibility to your mind from the EU side, or do you think the EU 27 have tied the hands of your colleagues too tightly, perhaps?
C'est une question...
That is a very good question, and you put it very cogently. The United Kingdom, once again, has decided to withdraw from the European Union. The British government has officially informed us that they will be leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, the customs union, which is an intrinsic part of the single market. We have taken due note, and in line with the remit I was given, we are pursuing these negotiations. And I would always encourage you, when in doubt, to have a close look at the guidelines on all the issues, if you want to know what my working method is, because I am meticulously following the guidelines. As I've said on a number of occasions, there are a lot of consequences for citizens, for consumers, for businesses. Perhaps not all have been debated in sufficient depth in the United Kingdom, but now is the time to explain what being a member of the European Union and the single market entails, and what no longer being a member of the European Union and the single market also entail in turn. And I would hope that there will be such a debate on an objective basis. We would be happy to take part. When I read some of the papers that David has sent me on behalf of the British government, in some proposals I see a sort of nostalgia. In the form of specific requests which would amount to continuing to enjoy the benefits of the single market and EU membership without actually being part of it. Now, maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick. Maybe there is no nostalgia. But as I said earlier, Brexit means Brexit. leaving the single market means leaving the single market. If that is what has been decided, there will be consequences. And as far as we are concerned, in particular, in terms of the integrity of the single market, the respecting the four freedoms and the absolute respect for the EU's decision-making autonomy when it comes to the single market. That has to be said, because it's simply the truth. And once again, it's not we are leaving, it's the United Kingdom has decided to leave the EU.
Yes, thank you. I wouldn't confuse a belief in the free market for nostalgia. The question of the flexibility. There is a structural arrangement in the European Union. Michel referred to it, which gives him a mandate, and that, of course, creates circumstances within which he can negotiate. But the phrase I've used, flexible and imaginative solutions, was a direct quote from the Council, the European Council, and I think they're right.
Okay, let's move on. Yes, please, gentleman here on the right from this end. Yes.
Matt Dathan from The Sun. Dave Davis, you refused to publish any details on the divorce bill, and instead you just ripped apart the EU's legal arguments. Do you concede that this approach is holding talks back? And to both of you, you both admitted the deadlock this week. Would you be prepared, both of you, to come back to Brussels more often, maybe next week, every week, until you break that deadlock? And David Davis, it surely can't be helpful having a former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, here hugging and kissing Jean-Claude Juncker at the same time as your press conference?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the movements of private citizens there and what they do. In terms of the approach, the European Union made a claim on the United Kingdom, on the United Kingdom taxpayer, for a large sum of money, unspecified but undoubtedly large, and on the basis of what it determined to be our legal obligations. And so the proper approach to that is to go through line by line and see whether or not we believe those legal obligations are correctly codified. Now, bear in mind what we have said, what the Prime Minister has said a number of times, starting in the Lancaster House speech before this process started, and repeated in the Article 50 letter, and repeated time and again after that. We will meet, we're a country which meets our international obligations, and will continue to do so. But those obligations have got to be well specified, and they've got to be real. They don't necessarily have to be legal. We also recognise moral obligations sometimes. But I think on this context, this was the right way to do it. It will, of course, lead to difficult exchanges. Nobody will pretend it was anything but a tough exchange this week. But I think the British taxpayer would expect nothing less, and your readers certainly.
If I may, and if I can say something on that very point, and it's part of the stuff that's tied up with the timetabling and all that, delays and whatnot. I said early on in the introduction that time was short, and there is a risk. We have to use the time we have properly and do things in their due order. And I've always said this here in front of you or whenever I spoke publicly. And the first thing one has to do is to agree on the principles of the big topics underpinning this withdrawal that the UK has decided upon. And we have agreed what these big topics or subjects are. Citizens' rights, Ireland, and the financial settlement. To settle the accounts. In order to make discussions simpler, we've set out a very precise list of commitments and accounts that have to be resolved, that the 28 subscribe to and the 27 will not agree to having to pay on their own based on the current financial perspectives. And we have a list of all the legal bases underpinning each of those commitments. I'm asked to show flexibility. But you need to start with a clear position based, for instance, on what the UK recognised as their commitments, legal and moral, as David has used the moral term as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are thousands upon thousands of individuals and businesses, students, universities, laboratories, local government bodies, not to mention third countries. I mean, we're talking about the EDF as well, the European Development Fund. These all have projects and programs that are ongoing, they've committed to, other taxpayers are involved. And they've all done this on the basis of something that was told to them by the EU 28 starting in 2014. I was Commissioner on Structural Funds, the Regional Policy Commissioner, for a while. So I know what it means for dozens of regions across the EU where they have a 7-year perspective of rolling payments, sometimes that only arrive after the 7-year period is over, and who've built projects on that basis. That's why I know what's at stake. That's what I'm talking about. I know there have been difficulties, and we've talked about that, but we've talked about a lack of progress. That's all I can say, that there has been a lack of progress, but beyond that, there is a strong commitment. The UK has made commitment to find a way forward. We need to find a solution to do that. Flexibility, yes. But hang on, what was it you actually said? I've forgotten the second word. Oh yes, imagination. It's a council question. Oh yeah, I know. Sorry. Well, everything is possible. And I mean, when it comes to presentation, the spread of payments or whatever, but we have to find a solution, because I have to go back to the 27 with a clear answer. That's my mandate. I have to reassure them first before we can go forward.
A question for Mr. Barnier and for Mr. Davis. In view of your analysis of the outstanding issues and financial issues in particular, Mr. Davis's intention to discuss these line by line, and as regards for Mr. Barnier, his methodology, which was not to do calculations but put in place a methodology to start with. What do you think the chances are of reaching a result before or in time for the October Council? And if no such result is forthcoming, will everything be held over until December?
La qualité.
On behalf of the 27, what we can say is that the quality of agreement we achieve on these three issues, and a high quality, sincere agreement, is reaching that is more important than the time frame. We will have shortly after this a technical briefing if you want more details. David has spoken about a line-by-line approach. We're for that too. Of course, there are other aspects too that come into play, but we have prepared the ground for this line-by-line, commitment by commitment, legal obligation by legal obligation. We're ready for that, and that's what we want, with a view to reaching agreement.
I agree. Quality of agreement matters more than time.
This concludes our press conference. Thank you all for your presence. Technical briefing follows.
Well, that came to an abrupt end, didn't it? Let's turn to our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall, who is in Westminster. There was a lot of talk of trust between the two participants there, Lewis.
No, they really didn't. I think, in a word, wow, Colin. I think Michel Barnier really didn't hold back in that press conference. I think, without doubt, it's the testiest the two sides have been, both personally, but it also reflects how tense and difficult those negotiations have apparently got over the last week or so. And I just took a note down, which I think in some ways really summed up the various positions of the two sides on the nature of the progress of the talk. So we had Michel Barnier saying there has been no decisive progress on key issues, and David Davis saying there has been concrete progress on the key issues. Who to believe? Well, clearly both sides have an agenda. And what I was really struck by from Michel Barnier in particular, he kept using this word consequences. He said there had to be consequences as a result of the UK leaving European Union, of leaving the single market. And that chimes, I think, with a lot of the mood music that's been coming out of Brussels over the past week, which is that with EU officials saying that Britain didn't seem to think there would be any consequences, that every arrangement there could be a bespoke arrangement to every problem, and that the European Union simply wasn't willing or prepared to do that, because they think that ultimately, if you leave the single market, if you leave the customs union, there have to be some consequences. Otherwise, why wouldn't every member of the European Union want to try and leave the organisation and famously, of course, cherry pick? That's the phrase that Angela Merkel most likes to use, and they simply don't want to be in a position where they allow the UK to do that. Also very emphatic, Michel Barnier, I think, for saying in no uncertain terms, don't try and pick off the European Union nation states against the EU negotiating team. He was very emphatic, wasn't he? He said there would not be an iota of difference between his team and the European Union member states. There had been some discussion before this summit that David Davis was playing for time, hoping to push negotiations down the track a little bit in the hope that European Union member states start to fall away and take separate negotiating positions from Michel Barnier's team. Clearly, Monsieur Barnier is very alive to that and doesn't and wants to ensure that is not the case. I think the bottom line is, of course, is that the UK needs to ensure that sufficient progress has been made on all of those key issues like Ireland and citizens' rights by October in order to start negotiating on the things that Britain wants to talk about, i.e. the future trade deal. I think after the tenor and spirit of that press conference, that seems rather far away.
Lewis, thanks very much.
Well, let's get more now on another big political story this lunchtime. Theresa May is saying that she wants to lead the Conservative Party for at least 5 more years, saying that she's in this for the long term.
And there's a long-term job to do. There's an important job to be done in the United Kingdom. We stand at a really critical time in the UK. Yes, that's partly about Brexit and getting Brexit right. But if you think back to what I said when I became Prime Minister, when I stood in Downing Street, there are many other issues that we need to address. Long-term challenges in our country, ensuring that people don't feel left behind, that we are able to see a country that is working for everyone and prosperity spread across the country.
Well, in response to the Prime Minister's remarks, we conducted a Sky Data snap poll to gauge the public's reaction to that. We asked if you think it would be a good or bad for the Conservative Party if Theresa May is leader at the next general election. 45% of people said they thought it would be a bad thing for the Tories. Meanwhile, 28% said it would be a good thing and 18% said it would be neither good nor bad.
Well, we then asked, would you be more or less likely to vote Conservative if Theresa May resigned as party leader? 17% said they'd be more likely to vote Tory, 9% said they'd be less likely to vote for the party, whereas 64% said it would make not a jot of difference.
Well, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Conservative peer, Lord Heseltine, cast doubt on May's future when he spoke to Colin earlier.
I don't think it's realistic that she will lead the Conservative Party into the next election. I think that we have probably a 2-year window before the next election. Anyone's guess, but my guess is 2 years. And that 2 years will be dominated by 3 issues. First, the economic situation, which is going to decline. Secondly, the levels of immigration, which are at the centre of the Brexit debate. And then, of course, the Brexit negotiations themselves, which are already humiliating, and I think as they unfold and become more detailed, will indicate to people just how unwise the whole Brexit process is. So I don't myself believe that there will be an appetite particularly the parliamentary party, to rerun the last general election. I think they'll want a new leader, and my advice to them very strongly is they'll also need not just to change the singer, but to change the song. Already the Labour Party have smelt the wind and are beginning to hedge their bets over Brexit.
The Brexit negotiations are humiliating, so said Lord Heseltine there. Well, let's talk to The Sun's political editor, Tom Newton-Dunn, who's in our Westminster studios, as is Gavin McGaw. He's a director at the public relations firm Hanover Communications and a former head of the Conservative Party's Rapid Rebuttal Unit. Gentlemen, a very good afternoon to both of you. Tom, do you agree with that characterisation of Lord Heseltine's, that the negotiations that we're seeing being played out in Brussels, looking at that press conference, the tone of things there, are humiliating for Britain?
No, I think that's probably going a little bit too far from Lord Heseltine. He has himself a extremely vested interest, we have to remember, as not just the Remainer-in-Chief, but the king of all Remainers of all time. Certainly that was, I watched it here alongside Lewis Goodall, your correspondent, absolutely spot on. That was by far the most testy exchange we've had so far from Barnier and David Davis together, and bad-tempered, and the huge division now between certainly the EU Commission negotiating team led by Barnier and the UK led by David Davis are now, for their all to see. Certainly, I mean, it's a humiliation if Britain has to retreat from what is now a very clear and potentially quite dangerous standoff. This now, I think, will have to go straight up to the EU 27. The 27 leaders are now going to have to broker a way forward. There is no way through this impasse between David Davis and Barnier. The British government, Theresa May, are already appealing to the 27 leaders to give Barnier a better mandate, or a wider, more flexible mandate to go into the talks so they can make progress. Barnier is stuck. I mean, he's right in saying that he has his mandate. It is inflexible. Therefore, David Davis's appeal for flexibility, he cannot possibly reach. But humiliation is probably too strong for the moment.
Yeah. Gavin, you've worked with David Davis. I wonder if they might just, at the Daily Mail picture desk, be looking at those images of David Davis. He looked tired in that press briefing. He looked like a man who'd been under some strain. Michel Barnier, by contrast, looked like he'd just walked out of a cafe in Saint-Tropez.
Well, I think that's been the way throughout these negotiations today. David's absolutely focused on getting the best result. This is incredibly complex negotiation. Barnier, as Tom says, is in a difficult situation too. It's not just our side is in a difficult situation. What we thought would happen earlier in the summer is that one side would have walked away for them to come back at a later date. We maybe are getting closer to that time. What we do know that both sides are absolutely focused on trying to get a win as soon as possible.
Tom, indisputably, your man in that press conference, the Sun reporter, had the best question when he wondered whether it was perfect timing for Tony Blair to offer to kiss to Jean-Claude Juncker as these talks were happening. There are all these noises off, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. You should find those pictures, by the way. They are amusing. Jean-Claude Juncker loves kissing people, almost as he loves slapping people. Is his sign of true affection. But I'd have to say, I think Blair going out to Brussels today, of all days, was a mistake. It is unnecessarily provocative to have a former Prime Minister being so friendly he's prepared to give a double kiss to a man who many consider the absolute arch enemy of Britain's interests in Brussels today, of all days. And you saw the slap down there from David Davis saying, I'm not going to comment on a private citizen's visits, which is extremely rude to refer to our former Prime Minister as.
Yeah, good point. Gavin, I'm in danger of sort of focusing on too many trivialities, really, you could argue. In terms of the substance and the weighty stuff, a lot's been written and said in recent days about this developing idea that we've reached an impasse, nothing's going to really move until October. It's a question now of accepting, actually, that Barnier, he's been given this pretty inflexible mandate. If you want his side to budge, you've got to work on the Germans, the French, the EU summit when it comes up.
And that's happening, without a doubt. There's so many different layers of negotiation going on behind the scenes with this. We've got numerous civil servants doing it. We've got David and his top team leading the way with Barnier, but lots of people beneath that. We will not be stopping doing that for sure throughout government for many, many, many months. And what we've got to see this, though, as is a marathon, not a sprint. We all get excited with every piece of emotional language that comes out of these press conferences, but we've just got to go with the flow. There will be movement. There is some movement already, as David said today, but we've got to find other ways to move it on, and that can only happen if we deal with the true subjects where negotiation really matters.
Tom, 7,000 miles away, an hour ago, the Prime Minister said, you need to stick with me because I can sort out Brexit.
Yes, I know. Rather unfortunate timing, that really, isn't it? I would agree with Gavin though, in the comment he just made, in that this is all great fun and theatre and spectacle for you and us in tomorrow's papers, and we'll have huge amounts of fun repeating all those nasty barbs that David Davis and Michel Barnier exchanged, especially on the nostalgia line. That was my favourite moment when Barnier accused the British of holding a position of nostalgia, wanting to have our cake and eat it with single market access, and David Davis hit back with the wicked barb, I wouldn't confuse nostalgia with a belief in free markets. So it's great fun. We really do actually need to take a step back and realise this is theatre for a purpose. Each side has its purpose in theatre. David Davis and the Tory cabinet want to look tough, don't want to look like they're giving in, certainly not too easily and too quickly, although I think certainly on the money argument that the bill, they will give in and pay a probably reasonably substantial bill, as that's our best chip. Likewise, Michel Barnier, Jean-Claude Juncker, they really do want to make Britain look like they're squealing. They want us to look uncomfortable. They want us to hurt, and publicly, because that's in precisely their own interest, to show the rest of the EU 27, the other countries who may be thinking about possibly repeating Brexit, what a very uncomfortable, painful thing it is. As Voltaire once said, it is pour encourager les autres. So there's a game going on here. Let's not fall for it on every single juncture.
Gavin, just before we get on to Theresa May, just one thought on David Davis's tactics and all this. If, as Tom suggests, things become increasingly acrimonious and antagonistic, is there a way that he can play that to his advantage? If he starts to look like a bullied victim, the British public might swing on side.
I think this is much more complex than we actually think. Barnier and him get on a one-to-one basis. That's a positive, without a doubt. Today, Barnier said that Brexit means Brexit, which in a weird way might help Davis back here at home. So I think there's lots of things going on behind the scenes here that we are maybe not aware of, and they may be giving each other little wins to try and help each other through. But let's just see how it plays out, as Tom says, over time. We can get obsessed with the Westminster bubble about this nuance and this comment, but let's try and look at it through more long-term vision.
Tom, fairly inelegantly, I was trying to nudge you towards the Theresa May topic in my last question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the obvious cue on that.
Well, as we've been discussing just a few moments ago, a rather frosty news conference in Brussels has just ended, with the EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier and the Brexit Secretary David Davis both making clear that not a lot of progress has been made in Brexit talks this week. Well, let's go to Brussels now to our European correspondent Mark Stone, who was at that news conference. And Mark, Michel Barnier saying he's not angry, he's not frustrated, but he's impatient, very impatient. What did you make of it all?
I thought he was frustrated, not angry. He said himself, "You'll know when I'm angry." But I think we just got a very brief glimpse, a window in on what those negotiations are like. You could feel the tension between these two men, far more so than in the previous few press conferences, all of which I've been at. You watch the body language between the two of them. This past week has gone very, very badly. I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. In fact, in the words of Michel Barnier, he talked about clarifications having been made on many points, but no progress at all on any of those key initial baskets, with the exception, he was clear to point out, of the Northern Ireland question, where, without going into a great deal of detail, he said there had been movement forwards on that. So one bit of encouragement there, but the key sticking point appears still to be those issues we've talked about time and again. It is the so-called divorce bill, the exit bill, Britain's financial contributions. Michel Barnier pointing out once again that while the EU side has been quite clear about what it believes is the basis for the amount of money that Britain owes the EU, they are still waiting for Britain to make clear its side, what it thinks that it owes the EU. It's worth remembering that the British government, contrary to what the likes of Boris Johnson might have said about Brussels having to go whistle for any money, the British government has acknowledged it will pay something. It hasn't said how much it will be. And to that end, Michel Barnier is saying, I will be flexible, I can be flexible, but I can only do that if you too come to the table with your side of the offer. So a very, very frosty exchange between the two of them. Not a huge number of questions. Wasn't an opportunity to ask many questions of either of them either. And Mr Davis is on his way back to London now. If things go on the current timetable, he won't be back for more negotiations for another month. Why does all this matter? Why is there so much concern over the timetable? Well, it's very simple. The longer they continue to argue and bicker over these separation issues, the shorter the time there is for Britain to be able to mould its future relationship with the EU, because as Michel Barnier reminded us once again, the clock is ticking. At midnight at the end of March 2019, Britain is out, deal or no deal.
OK, Mark Stone in Brussels, thanks very much.
More now on those Brexit talks in Brussels. It doesn't look like things are going well. Joined by Sebastian Payne, political writer for the FT, Financial Times. And also joined by, from Berlin by Stephanie Bolson, London correspondent for Die Welt newspaper. Hello to you both. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Ladies first, of course. There's a lot of anxiety, it would appear, in Brussels and the wider European Union that this deal is not moving as quickly as it should be. Is that right?
Yes, there is. I mean, talking to people in Brussels before the negotiations, nobody really expected much progress in this round, end of August. And they were saying, well, probably more is going to happen in September. But what is really a bit of irritating is that actually we have seen steps backwards. So Mr. Barnier was quite clear in saying, well, actually, London promised far more back in July than they have now put on the table. And that has really caused irritation and even a bit of anger in Brussels.
They're angry in Brussels, it would appear. Sebastian?
Yes, and I think what you saw in this press conference, the contradicting statements between Michel Barnier and David Davis, one saying no progress has been made, the other one saying actually concrete progress is being made. So the two seem to be completely at odds with each other over this. But you've got to remember in these situations, they've both got audiences to play to. Michel Barnier has got to look tough on Britain, to be unyielding and sticking to that mandate he's got from the EU 27. David Davis, on the other hand, wants to make it all look going swimmingly, that we're making good progress and it's all going to be fine in the long run. The key thing is to try and strip that away and look at the details. And the details that we do know is that no progress has been made on the bill. And that's the key thing from the EU's perspective. But some progress has been made on issues we heard today about the ECJ, about Ireland and about healthcare. So it's not as if everyone's just swimming around, not really going anywhere. But I think the key thing is time, that there's only 2 more rounds of these talks before that crucial EU summit meeting in October, and that's when they get to decide, do we move on to the future relationship part of these negotiations, because that's what David Davis really wants, to get to that point, to say we're not talking about divorce, we're talking about the future, and that's the real test of whether we're actually making any progress here.
OK, Stephanie, we're hearing there from Sebastian saying that there's some movement on the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, but it depends where you stand on that, I suppose. ECJ is a big sticking point, as well as Britain being too nostalgic, according to the European Union.
Yeah, well, I think Sebastian is right. There was a lot of posturing, of course, and they were both playing to their audiences. But I think there are some things that are not going so well, and Barnier was also commenting on this. So there is some impression that the British government is trying to split the Commission and the member states. And talking to people here in Berlin, they are really very, very clear. Barnier is the one who's negotiating on behalf of the member countries. So the idea that Theresa May now on the last miles will go to Berlin and convince the German Chancellor Angela Merkel that actually let's start talking about the future framework a little bit earlier. Maybe we can talk about the money. This is not going to work, especially not in Germany, because there are elections in 4 weeks' time. And Merkel has been very, very principled in her approach to Brexit, and that will not be changed.
Sebastian, Britain's demanding the impossible.
I think there is a big issue about flexibility here, because Michel Barnier has a very limited mandate about what he can and can't do. And if he's going to try and divide up some of the EU's core rules, he'll have to go back to those EU 27 heads and say, actually, we need a different mandate. Whereas David Davis, on the other hand, doesn't really have his hands bound at all. He can say whatever he thinks is sellable back in Britain. And that difference with a flexible Britain on one side and a rigid EU on the other side does make for a slightly testy dynamic, which I think you saw in that press conference today. And I think you're completely right about the German element to this, because this was David Cameron's mistake when he was trying to get that renegotiation last year, that he thought at the last minute Angela Merkel would come through and save Britain at the last moment by giving him something on free movement of people. It didn't work in 2017, and it certainly won't work this time, because we've heard time and time again from the EU side, all they care about is the sanctity of protecting EU interests. That remains the same again, but I think the key thing is to just try and strip away about the rhetoric here and look at where progress is being made and where the buffers are. And I think it really still is the money. You know, we've heard rumours about 100 billion euros, 60 billion euros. Until we get some more clarity on that, then the whole thing really seems stuck in the mud. And the real danger is there's a walkout from the British side, because if we walk out of those negotiations, that's going to waste even more time. It might look good back at home, but it's not going to help to get a deal.
Yeah, 100 billion potentially for the EU divorce settlement is what Sebastian was referring to there, Stephanie. One wonders how much the European Union actually wants this Brexit deal to go through. They don't really, do they? Because if it does, there'll be other countries that want to follow suit.
No, it's not about a sum, whether it's 100 billion or 60 billion. It's about finding a method to calculate what actually Britain owes the European Union in the sense of what they have committed to. And I think they will be very, very unforgiving on this, because they have said, we have agreed, you have signed a financial framework for 7 years until 2020. You cannot say, well, we are leaving 2019 and we're not paying from this point onwards. Now, what people are saying in Brussels and in Berlin as well is, well, Mrs. May has got a very difficult party conference ahead of her at the beginning of October. Let's see whether afterwards there will be still room of maneuver. So between the party conference and the European Council, which is, I think, on the 16th of October, that makes 10 days, that there might be some compromise found about how much there is to pay.
Sebastian, final thought from you. 100 billion, 60 billion, whatever it is, the clock is ticking, as we're hearing there from Stephanie. And one wonders how much the British government do actually want to leave when it comes to it.
And it's also how much British taxpayers are willing to stomach. We saw some very interesting polling this week that showed the only number that people felt was acceptable was about 10 billion, which is really not that much given some of the sums we've talked about. But I would say on the bill, we've been talking a lot about a transition deal, which would essentially keep the status quo for 2 or 3 years after Brexit Day, that would give time for the customs procedures, the immigration procedures to get in place. If we stay in the EU essentially during that transition period, then that means we'll still be paying into the budget. So that's going to tie up that part of it as well. So it's not going to be a day with a big paper check that we hand over to Brussels. It's more, what key obligations do we owe? And I think that's where we need to see some more clarity from really both sides here, because everyone talks about this, but nobody said, here's what we think you owe, here's what we think we owe, so then people can decide for themselves what is a fair sum of money.
Well, it's just like a divorce, isn't it? We must leave it there for now. Thank you both for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you.
The latest round of Brexit talks ended in Brussels today, with both sides suggesting the other was to blame for the lack of progress. A major sticking point is the so-called divorce bill, the amount Britain will have to pay as it leaves the EU. So the EU's Michel Barnier said no decisive progress had been made on key issues. But the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, warned that only flexibility and imagination would lead to a deal. From Brussels, our Europe editor Katja Adler reports.
Trust building between the two sides. That's what the EU says this first phase of Brexit negotiations is about. So by today, the end of round 3 of the first talks, how much trust is there?
It is clear that the UK does not feel legally obliged to honour his obligations after departure. How can we build trust and start discussing a future relationship?
For his part, David Davis said the UK couldn't blindly trust a divorce bill presented by the EU.
The Commission has set out its position, and we have a duty to our taxpayers to interrogate it rigorously.
Behind the smart suits, the stiff smiles, it was clear both sides were talking at cross purposes today about what Brexit subjects to tackle in which order and whether and how much progress is actually being made.
And I'll repeat that phrase.
David Davis painted the picture of a rigid, inflexible EU, while he argued
it's only through flexibility and imagination that will achieve a deal that works truly for both sides.
Je vois une sorte de nostalgie.
Michel Barnier insisted the UK had to be more clear and realistic about a Brexit deal. The EU couldn't show flexibility, he said, if the UK didn't show its hand.
J'ai jamais montré de la frustration.
I'm not frustrated, but I am impatient. It's not that I'm angry, I'm determined.
So where does that leave all of us? We know that Brexit will have a big impact on our lives, but just how huge will depend on the nature of a transition deal and a future permanent trade deal between the EU and the UK. We're nowhere near that yet, and all this deal making could still fall apart, though there's no need to panic just yet. The EU refuses to talk about the EU-UK future until there's substantive progress on the divorce deal. So where are we on the three core issues? Both sides agree reassuring EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU is a top priority, but they disagree still whether the European Court of Justice should have a role in guaranteeing the rights of individuals. On Ireland, progress has been made, especially around protecting the Northern Ireland Republic of Ireland common travel area. But the so-called divorce bill is the biggest sticking point right now. The EU wants the UK to pay up to €100 billion in what it sees as financial obligations the UK agreed to while an EU member. The UK says no, it will pay something, but refuses to specify. These Brexit talks have been largely technical. Political pressure to push for progress is unlikely to come from the UK or the EU until after the Conservative Party conference or the formation of a new German government following elections next month. Meanwhile, as the EU likes to repeat, the clock to the end of the UK's EU membership is ticking.
And we can talk to Katya now. Katya, there's clearly something of a standoff. So what happens now?
Well, I think, George, you'd expect a certain amount of bluster at this stage. Each one of those politicians standing tall and sounding tough because, of course, they're also speaking to their own domestic audiences. And if and when there are compromises, they want to show that that they were hard fought. But in the meantime, what I think is becoming clear and what could be dangerous for these talks is that they have very different positions and each politician is convinced that they will wear the other one down. But the EU will not indulge in that creative thinking that David Davis is asking for if it means breaking its own rules and regulations and weakening the single market. And the government will find it difficult to say to the people of the UK, I know we didn't tell you this, but it's going to cost us €100 billion to leave the EU, and we have to agree to it before we even know what we're going to get in terms of a future relationship. Both sides insist they want a deal, but something is going to have to give. So the question is, who is going to blink first?
Katya, thank you.
The EU's chief Brexit negotiator warned today that there's been no decisive progress in talks with Britain and there's still a big gulf between them. Michel Barnier accused the UK of making impossible demands and of being nostalgic for the single market. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, admitted it's been a stressful week but insists negotiations are going well. As our Europe editor James Mates reports from Brussels, the main sticking point remains money.
Another round of talks, another month closer to the UK's departure from the EU, but no nearer to a deal on an amicable divorce. Locked together since Monday, the two negotiating teams have argued over money, citizens' rights and the future of the Irish border, but mostly about money. The verdict was short and rather brutal.
Nous n'avons enregistré aucun progrès décisif.
We have not made any progress on any of the main topics, said the EU's chief negotiator. Then, switching to English,
EU taxpayers should not pay at 27 for the obligations undertaken at 28. After this week, it is clear that the UK does not feel legally obliged to honour his obligations after departure.
David Davis was barely more positive about where the talks are now.
I think we've succeeded in building mutual understanding, but it's also clear that there are still significant differences to be bridged.
I am concerned.
Throughout the press conference, it did seem that Michel Barnier is rapidly losing patience.
You seem frustrated, almost angry at the way these talks have gone this week. Do you think there is any chance of sufficient progress having been made by October?
I haven't wanted to show that I'm frustrated, but I am impatient and determined, he said. I've never shown anger. If I ever get angry, you'll know it.
Si un jour je suis en colère, vous le verrez, hein?
Even as they were talking, just a few rooms away, Tony Blair was in town meeting Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, which may well have been enough to make the British side pretty hot under the collar. The October deadline is the moment at which the other EU leaders will decide whether sufficient progress has been made for the talks to move on from divorce to the future trading relationship. At the moment, that is looking unlikely, and the British team here may find they are stuck talking about the legacies of the past until December at least. Even if those talks on the future do get underway this year, the signs aren't looking terribly good. Britain's put forward position papers. The response here is that they make it seem that London is already feeling nostalgic for the benefits of the single market, benefits that we'll lose if we choose to leave it. Of course, there's an element of both sides being in the negotiating bunker here, but time is working against Britain much more than it is against the EU.
Okay, James Mates in Brussels, thank you.
The latest round of Brexit negotiations have ended with tough talk and signs of irritation on both sides. Europe's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said there had been no decisive progress on any of the key issues. David Davis criticised the EU being neither imaginative nor flexible, he said. Money was at the heart of the disagreements. Mr Barnier said Britain was trying to avoid its legal obligation to pay for ongoing EU projects after Brexit. But Mr Davis insisted it was his duty to the UK taxpayer to question every bill. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Anyway, tell me about the week.
Yeah, but actually, kind of across all of the different strands, I think we've made progress pretty much everywhere.
The British verdict on this week's negotiations as delivered to David Davis by one of his senior officials. For a different perspective, listen to the European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier.
Mais nous n'avons enregistré aucun progrès décisif.
We did not get any decisive progress on any of the principal subjects.
David Davis spat back that it was the EU that was causing the delay because it's just too rigid about what should be negotiated when.
Our discussions this week have exposed yet again that the UK's approach is substantially more flexible and pragmatic than that of the EU, as it avoids unnecessary disruption for businesses and consumers.
When David Davis says he wants the EU to be flexible, what he means is he wants the negotiations to move on to the subject of Britain's future relationship with the EU right now. The 27 countries that are staying in the EU don't want to move on to that subject until, amongst other things, Britain's admitted what it will pay as it leaves the European Union. The bill, as it's been called, the future spending of the EU that Britain signed up to as a full member. But Britain this week challenged the £60 billion plus bill the EU has outlined, in effect saying there was no legal basis for it. That could be an opening gambit ahead of the expected haggling, but it outraged the European Commission.
After this week, it is clear that the UK does not feel legally obliged to honour its obligations after departure.
The European Union made a claim on the United Kingdom, on the United Kingdom taxpayer, for a large sum of money, unspecified but undoubtedly large, and on the basis of what it determined to be our legal obligations. And so the proper approach to that is to go through line by line and see whether or not we believe those legal obligations are correctly codified.
Whitehall sources say things could get a bit easier if and when the EU decides that the negotiations can move to the next phase, discussing Britain's future relationship post-Brexit with the EU. If the UK could pay most of the billions demanded by the EU, but call them a subscription to temporary membership of the single market in a transition period, that could make things a lot more sellable back in Britain. Prime Minister is expected to give a speech next month, which many officials here are hoping could begin to break the deadlock by spelling out what Britain wants from transition. To the irritation of EU negotiators, British officials keep trying to draw the talks into trade and the future relationship. In one sharp exchange today, Michel Barnier attacked hints from the British government that single market privileges could continue even after the transition period.
Dans certaines propositions, je vois une sorte de nostalgie.
In some proposals, I see a sort of nostalgia in the form of specific requests which would amount to continuing to enjoy the benefits of the single market and EU membership without actually being part of it.
Yes, thank you. I wouldn't confuse a belief in the free market for nostalgia.
Michel Barnier all but dismissed British hopes of moving on to the next phase of negotiations in October. But that's what the Prime Minister, continuing her visit to Japan today, is still hoping might happen. Theresa May yesterday gave interviews trying to kill off suggestions that she would quit Number 10 soon after the date of Brexit, March 2019. She said she'd lead the Tories into the next election, but privately, no one at the top of her party thinks that could really happen.
I said I wasn't a quitter, and there's a long-term job to do. There's an important job to be done in the United Kingdom. We stand at a really critical time in the UK.
The Japanese government promised it would make a trade deal with Britain an immediate priority after Brexit. Despite her best efforts, there are still doubts over whether Theresa May will be around to sign it.
So are businesses based here getting more worried about the future? All the uncertainty can't help. Neither does the falling pound, which is eating into their margins. It's all sent confidence slumping to its lowest level since last year. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is with me and has spent the day with a British startup. What are you hearing?
Well, Krish, obviously one of the groups that's very concerned about the outcomes of these talks is British business. But I have to say all the businesses that I spoke to today said there was no clarity whatsoever from the outcome of these talks. In particular, they want to know, will they remain in the single market, in the customs union as part of a transition deal to a new deal? But they didn't get any of those answers today. And that lack of clarity is beginning to have some very real consequences for businesses, as you'll hear from this startup that I went to see today. Let's hear what they had to say.
This is the physical balance game.
The ongoing Brexit negotiations aren't a million miles away from this new age board game.
That's it, just tap that.
Just like the talks, it's a fine balancing act, half rooted in reality, the other half in some kind of fantasy world, where big beasts try and score the most points.
And what we get is we get a whole new creature, the Shocktopus.
Beast of Balance is a startup, but one that's already managed to get its products into John Lewis and soon sold in the Apple Store. But like many British companies, it was hoping this week's talks in Brussels would bring it more certainty over its future.
We are 3 rounds into this negotiation and we're no closer to really understanding what the position is. And it just makes us tremendously weak. It means we have very little chance of taking advantage, of doing the best that we can out of this situation. And that's what every company within Britain needs to do, is to make the best of the situation that we have. We can't make the best of it if we don't know what that situation is. We're making our world a little bit more fabulous.
But the lack of clarity in the real world means it's already getting harder for them to recruit from the EU, and investment into the sector is falling. The tumble in sterling hasn't helped either.
The price that we set 18 months ago for this game, when we first set it up on Kickstarter, obviously the pound has plummeted since then, which means our revenues are a lot less, but our costs are the same. And so place it on the stack.
But the stack, in EU negotiation terms, is a very wobbly place to be.
It's getting a bit tricky now.
It is. Now it's starting to get a bit more challenging, isn't it?
And how destabilising is that for businesses like yours and for the wider business community?
What it means is we have to think short term. So where we should be making long-term decisions, where we should be thinking 5 years, 10 years, we're really only able to deal with what's going to happen next year. And that's not a great way to run a business. You know, doing business is hard. It's hard to establish a new product. It's hard to create a new market. It's hard to build all the relationships that you need around the world. To then tie one hand behind our back as well, it's just kind of insane.
So the big beasts continue to thrash it out in Brussels.
We've made it a little difficult for ourselves.
The worry is, with no progress, it could all come crashing down.
Yes, that's the view of one small business, Chris, though he does echo the view of many. But I also spoke today to one very senior business executive who told me in no uncertain terms, and I quote him, the progress in Brussels, he says, is unsatisfactory, and that he is exasperated at the lack of progress coming from David Davis, which he puts down not to clever tactics, but to the fact, he says, that there clearly is no clear cabinet position on Brexit, which is very damning. Now, while it's true to say on the plus side that the British economy is moving along steadily, it's still growing, although that growth is slowing, he says there are very real signs that businesses are beginning to pull their investment. Now, why does that matter? It matters because there is a lag, a time lag, if you like, between that lack of investment and how that shows up in economic impact, typically of about 2 to 3 years. In other words, Chris, just as that lack of investment is showing up, we are leaving the EU when the British economy, you would think, would need all the help it can get.
Thanks, Siobhan. Well, I'm joined now from Hertfordshire by the Conservative MP Vicky Ford, and with me here in the studio, the Labour MEP Seb Dance. Vicky Ford, are you worried at the lack of progress?
I think we've always known it's going to be a very complicated negotiation, and actually I've always said this particular period is going to be the most complicated because we're literally less than a month to the German elections. There'll be huge pressure on Michel Barnier not to give any flexibility on his side, and that will be partly why he's not giving any room at the moment. They need a deal on the money. We want a deal on the trade relationship. It's difficult for us to give a deal on the money until we know more about what the long-term relationship's like. My experience of EU negotiations is that until you get closer to deadlines, people don't move so much, and I'm not surprised that actually Europe is not moving much this side of the German elections.
Sorry, I should say, I know it's difficult when you're looking into a camera. If you try and look into the camera rather than off camera, then it's easier to have a conversation.
Can you hear me?
But does that make it more likely that we are heading for a no-deal situation?
As I said, this side of the German elections, we've always known it's going to be very difficult. The other side, next month, the following months, I'm expecting some more, possibly some more flexibility from Europe's side.
Okay.
They need a deal on the money, and we need to get the talks moving on the trade relationship. It's like every deal. Until you know where you're going to end up in the long term, it's difficult to understand where you're going to short term.
Seb Dance, it's easy to jump up and down and say, well, they're making a mess of it. It's a negotiation. It takes time.
It is a negotiation, and of course Vicky's right, there is a certain element of staging to it, but I don't think we can just dismiss the lack of progress after 3 rounds of talks as simply part of the way in which the EU normally negotiates things. That simply isn't the case. What we're hearing from all of our colleagues in the rest of the Parliament, from other member states, is that they're completely exasperated about what it is that Britain wants. And I think it was very telling that the German government, in response to the position papers that the government put out, said it reads like a country wanting to join the European Union and not leave it.
So do you think Barnier is right when he says the British position on the single market, for example, which is that we want access to the single market, but we want our own regulations, and for the rest of the single market to accept it, that is impossible?
It's impossible.
He's right to say that.
Well, I mean, how do you redefine the rules of a club if you've decided to leave that club? That is the fundamental problem we've got here. And we are identifying a number of areas that businesses, that unions, that NGOs, that whole of civil society is saying are essential to keep. And we're saying we want to keep those, but we don't want to abide by any of the rules or pay any of the costs towards that upkeep. That doesn't make any sense.
The Labour position now is an interim deal in which we would remain part of the single market and we would accept freedom of movement.
Yeah.
So you are basically giving up there, aren't you? Because you're saying
No.
we would have no say in Europe. We'll keep paying into Europe in order to have access to the single market for a bit.
When you think back to what was said in the referendum, we were told by the Leave campaign that if we left the European Union, we would have a whole new series of economic opportunities open to us. That's now not the case. The truth is becoming far more evident. Can we really renegotiate our relationship with the biggest market in the world in 18 months? Or can we have a sensible approach that says, look, if we're leaving the European Union, let's not destroy business, let's not destroy jobs and opportunities, stay in the single market and the customs union for as long as it takes as a transition. That is the safe option, and I think anything else is simply reckless.
Vicky Ford, do you favour this idea of a transitional deal?
We need to have a transitional period so that businesses, both in Europe and in the UK, have as much certainty as possible and a time to move to new rules. I too have been talking to people on the other side of the negotiating table and was in Dublin and Belfast just last week looking at border issues. And what I'm hearing is a lot of the people on the other side of the negotiating table, the European negotiating side, saying no to the UK before they've even tried to look at the different options we suggested. So we've suggested some detailed options on customs issues, on what would happen at our border. They're creative solutions, and it's no good if the other side of the table is just saying no without even trying to investigate
do you accept
if it works. So I would encourage both sides.
Is going to have to change her position on freedom of movement for that interim deal? I mean, you know, Britain can't have an interim deal in which it has access to the single market without accepting that for that interim deal we're also going to have freedom of movement.
So let's look at where we want to end up long term. There are many countries outside the EU that have different relationships with the single market and have access to the single market with different types of rules. And the closer a trade deal that we get, the more we'll be prepared to pay for it. And we need to understand where we're going to end up in order to be able to have a discussion on things like what we're going to pay for it. And that is where I'm afraid we're seeing Europe being very rigid. That does not surprise me, because this side of the German elections, that is what we were expecting. So as I said, this is a complicated negotiation. Both sides need to make it clear that they're not making it easy for the other side. That's for political reasons. But I do expect that we will get more movement just as we get closer to the as we get closer towards the deadlines and as the politics get softer after the German elections.
As we get closer to what could be a cliff edge, do you think public opinion is changing? I mean, is that what's really behind the Labour change in policy?
No, I think that the Labour change in policy reflects the views of the membership of the Labour Party by and large. I think a lot of my colleagues in Westminster and, of course, my colleagues in Brussels as well have been making the case for a long time for a transition that involves a single market. But I think public opinion is shifting, but I don't think that it's shifting in anything like the way that people who are kind of on the coalface, if you like, in politics think it is. I think most people probably think, why hasn't Brexit happened yet? Let's just get on with it. And we have to accept that. As somebody who doesn't think we should leave the European Union, I accept that that is where the public is at the moment. But the reality is being played out. And the reality of the government's hopelessness on this is being played out. And I think as bit by bit we go through this, that will become more and more clear to people.
Seb Downs, Vicky Ford, thank you both very much.
There are only so many ways you can say nothing has been agreed. The EU's Brexit negotiator has now tried most of them. In today's press conference, Michel Barnier warned that no decisive progress had been made, while David Davis called for the need for flexibility and imagination. We were all left to imagine what that might mean. Testy exchanges and the lack of real momentum in talks so far raises a very real prospect of deadlock in the 2 rounds of talks left before mid-October. That's when the EU27 leaders must decide whether they can say sufficient progress has been made. It's all complicated, isn't it? And this is only the beginning, although perhaps that's the point. It shouldn't be. To our political editor in a second with his news, but first, Chris Cook has a look at the day.
Just listening to today's press conference, you'd be forgiven for thinking the UK and the EU27's representatives hadn't been in quite the same meeting.
This week we've had long and detailed discussions across multiple areas, and I think it's fair to say we've seen some concrete progress.
We did not get any decisive progress on any of the principal subjects, even though, I want to say, even though on the discussion we've had about Ireland, that discussion was fruitful.
So what can you take from today? Well, there were a few things to note. First, on the argument about what we owe, the EU27 claims we've changed our position.
In July, the UK recognised that it has obligations beyond the Brexit date. But this week, the UK explained that these obligations will be limited to their last payment to the EU budget before departure.
This matters because the agreed EU budget runs for 21 months after we leave, and it has day-to-day running costs predicated on our contributing. The Bruegel think tank estimates that those costs could be 10 to 15 billion euros, and that's a hole the EU needs to fill.
The Commission set out its position, and we have a duty to our taxpayers to interrogate it rigorously. At this round, we presented our legal analysis on on-budget issues, on off-budget issues, and on the EIB, the European Investment Bank. It's fair to say across the piece we have a very different legal stance.
Second, Mr Barnier also talked about red tape.
The UK wants to take back control, wants to adopt its own standards and regulations. Well, but it also wants to have these standards recognized automatically in the EU. That is what UK papers ask for. This is simply impossible.
So, for example, we won't be allowed to sign a deal with the EU which lets us get rid of EU rules and has our exports treated like EU products at ports. Also, note how the EU is using its bureaucracy against us. They've set out a negotiating mandate for the EU27, which has been agreed, and that makes it time-consuming and difficult to offer us concessions.
This mandate was fixed to us from the outset, from day one, by the 27 heads of state and government, meeting as they were in European Council under the presidency of Donald Tusk. Naturally, we also work very closely with the European Parliament.
Mr Davis, meanwhile, kept talking about our flexibility.
The UK's approach is substantially more flexible and pragmatic than that of the EU. Pragmatic and innovative solutions is about pragmatically driving the process.
Taken together, the impression you get from today is we're willing to bend, the EU isn't. But look, this is a negotiation. Everyone is posturing. The state of play right now is that both sides are taking different approaches on the money, and the EU's holding a hard line on regulation. But the whole point of a negotiation is that positions can change.
And that was Chris Cook. Well, with us now, Nick Watt, our political editor, and has some intriguing new details, Nick.
Yes, well, as we were hearing, that was a pretty scratchy day there in Brussels. The UK is hearing figures of 100 billion euros to pay to leave the EU. And David Davis, of the old saying, says, you must be joking. Now, I was told by quite a senior EU official a few months ago that they would actually settle for a figure of around 34 billion euros. And what I've learnt is that in Whitehall, they would be willing to look at a figure of around about 30 billion euros. And one senior source said to me, if we talk seriously about that, then we are going to the races. So the obvious question is, how do you achieve that? Well, what you would do, an idea doing the rounds, is that you would use the transition period. This is the period of 2 to 3 years after we leave the EU. You'd use that transition period to settle the accounts. And essentially what would happen is that the UK would continue to pay roughly the amount that it's paying. That's about 10 billion a year, 30 billion over 3 years. That would allow you to do the transition, and then it would settle the accounts. And what that would do is it would solve that problem for the UK, but it would also ensure that the EU would not have a black hole in its accounts, because the UK is responsible for 13% of the EU budget. Can I give you 2 big caveats on this idea that was put into the public domain last week by Charles Grant, the director of the Centre for European Reform? Caveat number 1 is this is not policy in Whitehall, but it is being looked at very seriously. Caveat number 2, the UK will not accept any figure on the back of a fag packet. It's got to be legally credible and binding.
And that would end then after the transition period, would it?
Yes, and then obviously you're then saying, well, what will we do in the future after the transition? Now, Theresa May in her famous Lancaster House speech said there would be an end to vast payments, but the UK would make payments to be in some EU programmes. And what I've learnt, these are the programmes that we would be willing to pay to be in the future. Horizon 2020, that's an 80 billion euro research fund to take basically science projects to the market. The Galileo project, that's an EU global satellite navigation system. Erasmus, which is the student exchange programme. And how about this? Euratom. That's the civil nuclear watchdog. Bit of a problem there
talked
because it's overseen by the ECJ, but they would use the mechanism of a sort of an arm's length relationship with the ECJ to deal with that one.
Good work, Nick. Thank you.
I've been getting